Okay, everyone, it's time for us to talk about plate tectonics. Now, I will admit this is one of my very favorite topics. The reason is because at one point in time I thought about going into geology because I found it so fascinating. But we have a lot of good stuff to talk about today, and I think the first thing we'll start with is the Hutton rock cycle again. Just as a reminder, what I want you guys to be able to do, by the way, is to draw this out and to explain it, and that will be in the next slide. So, if I ever, hint, hint, ask you to draw out James Hutton rock cycle, hint, hint, this is what I expect to see. Have I given you enough hints yet? You should be able to draw the rock cycle. Okay, not only that, you should be able to use a description to step me through it. So let's do that together. So you're starting out with a mountain range. Okay, so wind and water will help to degrade that, and then the sediments will get transported out to sea. And by the way, we're starting the top and we're going clockwise. Then what happens is as those sediments get deposited, they will eventually get deposited as strata. Okay, now the one thing this is missing is to add heat and then pressure as well. Okay, because once those sediments are deposited, it takes heat and pressure to make them convert to rock. Okay, then over time you can have tectonic uplift. Okay, and that's what creates the mountain range and so forth. And then you start the decay of continents and you basically start all over again. Okay, so what you should be able to do is describe like I just did, okay, to draw it out as well, okay, and hopefully it should make sense to you as far as, you know, what's what. Now, the other thing I want you to consider is where would you be most likely to find fossils? That's an excellent question. So in order to address that, by the way, we're going to go through the different types of rock in the next couple of slides. So keep this in the back of your mind, okay, as we're going through it, and figure out what types of rocks should be found where, okay, and where you might find fossils too. Okay, so igneous rocks, these are the most interesting, and well, yeah, you won't, I think they're pretty cool. So maybe I need to get out more. At least that's what my husband says. Anyway, I like to think I'm in the right field. So igneous is Latin for fire, and so what this means is these are rocks that basically come straight from magma that comes from the mantle, okay? Now there's three different examples here. There's basalt, okay, there's also diabase and granite. These are all examples of igneous rock. So now what I want you to do is think about where would you find these potentially on the rock cycle. Okay, so that's what I wanted you guys to know for the slide. Now, sedimentary rock, these are basically sediments that will either precipitate out or they will gather or something along those lines. Okay, sandstone is a great example of this, so is salt. And did you guys know, by the way, that underneath Detroit is a huge salt mine, okay? And it's actually been there since the 1800s. And it's gone through a couple different owners. Initially, it's where people used to get table salt. By the way, it runs most of the underneath of Detroit. These days, though, I think it's mainly used for rock salt for highways and stuff, because I think they took all the good quality salt out. Coal is another sedimentary rock. Okay, so these are rocks that basically are composed of sediments or precipitate out or something along those lines. And so that's where they got their name from. Something I forgot to mention in the previous slide, by the way, is that coal tends to contain a lot of fossils. Okay, so you will find, believe it or not, a lot of fossils of plant material and so forth in coal. And later on in the class, we'll talk about how they got there. Now, metamorphic rock basically is either igneous rock or sedimentary rock after you've added some heat and pressure. Okay, so metamorphic means it's changed shape. Different examples of this are malachite, marble, eyes are getting bad, slate, and then schist. Okay, so those are three examples of metamorphic rock. So remember, it's just another type of rock that's added heat and pressure, but it's so much that's actually made it transform. Alfred Wegener was a really interesting guy, and he was one of the first ones to propose that continents actually shift around, and that in fact they kind of fit together like puzzle pieces. Okay, so he lived from the 1880s to 1930, and what was really interesting about this is he kind of proposed this idea before he really knew about plate tectonics and how things shifted around. So let's say you're a scientist, you think you've made this cool discovery, but you don't exactly know the mechanism. Would you actually publish it, or would you wait until the mechanism was found out? This is something he had to deal with, and he decided to publish it early. He did get jumped on by other scientists, but in the end, they just found more and more support for his theory, which was great for him. And so, as a scientist, it's what you guys want always, is to be backed up by other scientists who've had independent research and they find the same things you do. That's a really cool feeling. So one thing that led him to discover this, by the way, is that he kind of realized that the continents could fit together like puzzle pieces, okay? And that just seemed to be a little too coincidental. So that's part of what led him to propose this hypothesis. Now, it turns out, by the way, that the continents actually move about 2 centimeters per year. And I think I might have mentioned that earlier in an earlier lecture. Think of it, guys, 2 centimeters. You can actually count 2 centimeters. You can see 2 centimeters. I mean, granted, it takes 365 days to make it happen, but we're talking about the tectonic plates that are floating on magma. Still very, very cool, I would say. At least I think so. Other ideas that led to his theory was that you could actually find fossils of certain unique creatures across continents, okay, that seem to be there at approximately the same time. And you can see here, for example, the different fossils found in South America, in Africa, in India, and so forth. And the reality is most likely those critters, lived at the same time, of course. But in order for them to share that area, those continents must have been pushed together, because I don't know about all of you, but none of those guys look like super great swimmers to me. At least not to cross continents the way that we know and love them today. So things definitely must have shifted in order for him to detect these patterns. Okay, guys, so what I want you to be able to realize is that on the bottom left, that is a cross-section of the Earth. So you've got the solid iron core, you've got the liquid iron core, you've got the mantle. If you guys ever watched the movie Journey to the Center of the Earth, by the way, not going to happen. So what I will post in class, by the way, is that the deepest hole in the Earth was actually created by the Soviet Union. And it's not that deep. And what ended up happening was they don't, and we don't have the technology to be able to actually drill any further, okay, because all the drills started melting, which is pretty cool. The other thing I'd like to draw your attention to is that little bitty layer on the top, that tiny one labeled crust. Yeah, that's us. I don't know if any of you all find that a little unsettling, but I kind of do, okay? So, yeah, just a little unnerving. So you can look at it like a slice of a pie, okay? If you look at the figure to the right, you can see the little layer of the crust, okay? All that mantle, then you get to the core. Okay, and so again, we've never actually been able to journey to the center of the Earth. I don't know that it's ever actually going to happen. At least I'll be long dead by the time that technology's around, so it'll be okay. You guys can deal with that. Now, I'd also like you guys to know that there are approximately 12 large tectonic plates. Did I mention 12 large tectonic plates? Did I mention there's 12 plates? Write that down, okay? There's 12 large tectonic plates. Now, you don't have to memorize or, remember all of these here. Again, open note, open book. I don't think I'd ask you to piece that together anyway. That just gives me a headache. But anyway, just realize that there's 12 and then you're good to go. Okay, so the plates all shift around, okay? And so you can have what's called a divergent plate where they're actually moving apart from one another. And once that actually happens, you're creating new seafloor. You can have convergent plates where they are coming together. One might sink underneath the other one. That happens quite often. And you can see here when that happens, you get volcanoes popping up because that crust will melt again. You can have plates that are sliding by one another, okay? And that's actually pretty common. And by the way, that's what's going on in California. So all the California earthquakes and so forth are because one plate is sliding by the next one. And generally, it's not like a smooth transition, right? So energy will get built up and built up and built up, then all of a sudden it just kind of explodes and there's movement. But this is when the humans feel it, and a lot of our structures are damaged, unfortunately, because of the fact all that energy is built up. But that's actually what's going on. So from a scientist perspective, it's fascinating. From a human one, well, yeah, unfortunately it happens. One really good example of a divergent area is known as the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, where the plates are moving away from one another, okay? And so you get kind of this bumpy area because this is where new magma is coming in to form the new seafloor, okay? So just realize that, that's an example of that particular type of plate boundary. Now we also have convergent, where they're coming together, but generally when this happens, one plate tends to slide underneath the next one, okay? Because if they constantly bump into one another, mountain ranges form, but it gets pretty violent over time. So, so this is convergent. So what this particular picture and figure is meant to show you is the location of where the plates are coming together in a convergent boundary, and location of the volcanoes that are formed, of course, because once you have one plate sinking underneath the other one, remember that crust will melt and that magma has to go somewhere, so very often it will actually come to the surface and form volcanoes. So that's what those little red the little red triangles are meant to represent, is the formation of volcanoes due to the plates coming together. So something else I want you to consider is the Hawaiian Islands, and I'm sure you realize this, or maybe you've at least heard it before. They're actually created due to volcanoes, and what it is there's a weak spot, okay, in the crust, and so then you'll have one volcano form, and then the crust moves a little bit, and then a second island will form. The crust moves a little bit, and the next island will form, okay? And you can see the oldest to the youngest of the islands, which is pretty fascinating. And again, that's just due to a weak spot in the crust, which is pretty cool. So basically, plate tectonic cycle is responsible for the rock cycle. And I've asked you this before, and I'm telling you this again. Hint, hint, I never tell you anything unless I'm going to ask you again, hint, hint. Where would you find these different types of rocks, okay, on the rock cycle? So go back, think about it, make sure you're comfortable. Also make sure you can define each of these, and then once you can, you're ready to go. So what this figure is meant to show is the time that existed long ago and how the different continents kind of pieced together. Okay, so you can see here 225 million years ago during the Permian there was Pangea, then the Triassic, things were starting to split, okay, then the Jurassic, and so forth until we get to the time period that looks very similar to today. Okay, so remember, 2 to 10 centimeters per year is how fast things move, but this gives you an idea of, things fitting together like a puzzle piece the way that was actually suggested, and continental drift and so forth, which is pretty interesting. Now, biogeography was actually invented by Alfred Russel Wallace, and you should know this guy's name because actually when Darwin came up with natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace also came up with it at a very similar time period, and we'll talk about that story a little bit later, but Alfred Russel Wallace also came up with the theory of biogeography. Okay, so this is the science that basically tries to explain and document how different patterns are formed of biodiversity and where different species are found. Actually, it's really cool. Like, this is one of my favorite because you can figure out like who's located where and why. Okay, and that to me is just fascinating because you want to know, like, well, how did they disperse there? How did they get there? Why are they still there when other species aren't? Well, that's what this tries to address, which is, again, very, very cool. Now, there's 2 different ways you can study biogeography. You can use the historical and the fossil method, okay, where you try to consider history and how things have shifted around and so forth, and then use fossils to figure out who is located where, and that's a very reliable approach, don't get me wrong. But people also tend to look at the study of species based on ecological methods like competition and who outcompetes who and so forth on a more modern time scale. But both of those ways are definitely legit ways to study this particular field. So biogeographic realms, these are really interesting because basically what these are is this is where different species have evolved to live in these areas. So you guys have heard of the term invasive species versus endemic or native species, okay? And so when you do the endemic or the native species, that's who evolved there, and the invasive species, those are ones that are introduced, okay? And so the realms are basically you get this collection of species that evolved to live in these particular areas, which is pretty awesome because they all have different traits that allow them to be successful in those areas. So we have all sorts of different amazing species that have evolved to live around the world. And so we have snakes and frogs and butterflies and bats, and I know bats are getting a particularly bad reputation lately. However, on the side of the bat, I just want to tell you all that bats can eat up to thousands of blood-sucking mosquitoes, okay? And so anything that can consume the mosquitoes that carry diseases is A-okay by me, okay? It's just that you want to leave them alone because they can, you don't want to certainly want to be careful of touching them and so forth, and don't want to do any of that, because they do carry a lot of diseases that can get carried over to humans, obviously. But don't discount our little bat brethren friends, because, again, they eat mosquitoes. I'm okay with them. So I even make a habit, and this tells you how big of a geek I am, but I try to walk my dogs at night at dusk, because when you do, a lot of the birds settle down for the day, and you can determine, or you can see the bats flying around, because they have a very different flight pattern, and they just look different as they're flying. And so, if you guys want to go out next time, go into your neighborhood and so forth. Be careful, though, especially in this day and age, be very careful. Go with friends, okay? But just go for a walk and kind of look up in the sky and see if you guys can find any bats. And then you can thank them for eating all those thousands of mosquitoes, because I most certainly do. So things to consider is that we have taxa that have all sorts of different patterns of distribution. Okay, some of them are found in only one biogeographic realm, which means they're pretty specific and they're picky in their habitats. Some of them can be found dispersed into many different realms, okay, and others have what are called disjunct distributions. What I want you to think about with that is just patchy distributions, okay? And so again, with biogeography, you're trying to understand why they are present in certain areas and why they might be absent from others. And this is half the fun when you're trying to piece together who's where and why. So there's a couple different possible explanations that might be behind the patterns we see today, okay? So one is called dispersal. And so with dispersal, what I want you to think about are like seeds in plants that get dispersed to new areas, and then they will germinate and grow new trees, and those will be successful. And so they basically establish in a new population because these seeds dispersed there, okay? And they might not exist. You might have two populations that there's nothing in between them, okay? So it's patchy. And that's one potential reason for that pattern being there, is that it was dispersed to the new area. A second potential reason is called vicariance. And so what I want you to think about with vicariance is, let's say you had one really big population at one point in time. But let's say it got split, and let's say something happened to the population in between, and so they no longer exist there, but they exist at the two extremes. Okay, so when you have one population at one point in time that gets split and everybody in between disappears, okay, that's vicariance versus dispersal, where it gets dispersed into a new area. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, and I'm going to try to upload some additional readings on that, because sometimes when we deal with concepts that are relatively new, and they're not always necessarily easy to picture, sometimes it's nice to hear it in multiple forms. So I'll make sure to try to upload some information there too for you. Now, let's say you're a biogeographer and you come across these two disjunct or patchy populations, and you want to know if it's dispersal or vicariance, and you ask yourself, well, how in the world would you distinguish these? And I would say, aha, excellent question. One thing you could do is you could look in the fossil record. Okay, so you could look in the fossil record and see if both of those populations have been there for a long time period, and then maybe you would even detect some fossils in the area where they're not found anymore, in which case that would tell you that it is vicariance. Okay, however, let's contrast that, and let's say in one area the fossil record is really old and they've been there a while, but the other one is relatively new and there's no fossils in between. That would be dispersal. And by the way, draw this out if it helps it make sense to you. Okay, so as I say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Another method you could distinguish this from is known as phylogenetics, and basically that's just using DNA. Okay, and so you can use DNA to distinguish the two. If your populations have been separated for a really, really, really long time, let's say through vicariance, then genetically they're going to be super distinct from one another. Okay. However, let's say it was dispersal, where one population was an offshoot of another one, then all of those genes should be a subset of the bigger population. And once again, draw a picture. Okay, so, and I will try to again find some information that might help this as well, because I know if you're not, it's hard for me I wish I was standing in front of the classroom because A, I miss you guys, but B, a lot of times I can do some drawings that make it easier to understand things too. But I will do my best to find some supplementary material that you guys find interesting. Now, quiz 1 stops here, of course, as it should. Okay, I'm going to release it Monday night, and you will have 48 hours to address it. No, you don't need the whole time, so don't panic, and no panicking. Okay. It's just meant to make sure that you're listening and you're paying attention and you're learning. That's what I care about. Okay, so make sure you cite your lectures and slide numbers. When you do address the questions, you're welcome to use outside information, but what I really want you to do is to start with the lectures, and you can just boost it with outside information. I will also hold office hours probably on Wednesday. So if you guys have questions, what I ask of you though, when I hold office hours, keep your questions general. Okay, so I can't really filter things through Zoom, and I want to make sure that it's an exam, right, or it's a quiz, and so I want you guys to ask me questions because, of course, I'm not there in person, but you got to keep it general and do your best not to give anything away. Okay, that's all I ask. All right, guys, I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. I will have office hours on Monday and then again on Wednesday. And I'll send out the Zoom invite soon. Stay safe, everybody.